and welcome to The Edge. Well, we're taking in-depth analysis of today's top stories by looking beyond the edge. We'll bring you not just the facts, but also deep insights into the topics with expert opinions and social media reactions. Let's make a start with our look beyond the edge. Egypt's irrigation minister says that he has received official notice from Ethiopia that it has begun filling the reservoir behind its giant hydroelectric dam, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, for a second year. Egypt has informed Ethiopia of its categoric rejection of the measure, which it regards as a threat to regional stability. So why can't Ethiopia and Egypt reach an agreement to solve the crisis? And why is Ethiopia rejecting calls to involve mediators? Iran accused Israel of sabotage that targeted a nuclear facility near Tehran last month, as authorities acknowledged for the first time that the mysterious assault had caused structural damage to the site. The accusation could further complicate talks between Iran and 6 major powers on reviving the 2015 nuclear deal. Can the parties reach a common point? What are their demands? Newly released data from the Gun Violence Archive reveals that over 230 people were killed in a 3-day 4th of July holiday weekend. Casualties took place in more than 400 shootings nationwide. How can gun violence be prevented before many more lives are tragically wasted? So these are the top 3 stories that we'll be taking a look at today from Beyond the Edge. Let's get started. The sharing of the River Nile's waters is of fundamental concern to countries both up and down the waterway, meaning that anything that affects its flow is a worry for a total of 11 Nile Basin countries. Our infographic gives an overview of the key events of the escalation. Ethiopia has started the second phase filling of its controversial Grand Renaissance Dam, despite Egypt and Sudan's protests, stoking tensions that could threaten regional stability.
Egypt's irrigation minister said on Monday that he had received official notice from Ethiopia that it had begun filling the reservoir behind its giant hydropower dam, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, for a second year. Irrigation Minister Mohamed Abdelati said in a statement that Egypt had informed Ethiopia of its categorical rejection of the measure, which it regards as a threat to regional stability. The UN called on Ethiopia, Sudan and Egypt on Tuesday to recommit to talks on the operation of a giant hydropower dam, urging them to avoid any unilateral action, a day after Ethiopia began filling the dam's reservoir. The UN Security Council will likely discuss the Grand Ethiopia Renaissance Dam this week, after Arab states requested the 15-member body address the issue. Ethiopia said the dam on its Blue Nile is critical to its economic development and providing power to its population. Egypt, however, views the dam as a grave threat to its Nile water supplies, on which it is almost entirely dependent, Sudan, another downstream country, has expressed concern about the dam's safety and the impact on its own dams and water stations.
And discuss the latest developments, I'm joined live from Minneapolis in Minnesota by Edo Dewano, who's an Ethiopian activist, and from Washington, D.C. by Mokhtar Kamal, who's a political analyst. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us again here today on The Edge. Edo, can I come to you first? Could you tell us what is the latest situation with the Grand Renaissance Dam?
As we know that the second round of filling has started already. As we know that right now it is the very rainy season in Ethiopia. So the government pretty much taking this opportunity to go ahead and then fill the dam as planned. So that's what is taking place right now. In doing so, the government have also notified the Egyptian officials about the process that's taking place. So this is what's going on at this point.
And so this is the second year of filling, and at this pace, what is the aim from the Ethiopian side?
The aim is that during the first round, about 5 billion cubic meter was filled, and this time, if the rain continues to pour, the government expects that the reservoir will build up to 30 billion cubic meters. So that's what the hope is.
Mokhtar, let's come to you now. We should be celebrating that Ethiopia is building its infrastructure, is building for its future and the creation of electricity supply for a country that sadly needs it because the amount of electricity they have at the moment is very low. What's your take on the current situation?
Well, basically, the call from the Ethiopian side that it's just for development and generating electricity and all this stuff is kind of a very thin veil, because I mean the Nile is a cross-border river. There are a lot of international law articles that govern and control that. Obviously, Ethiopia has been refusing any intermediation, whether through the United States, through other parties, and most recently, the Security Council. In fact, there are many Ethiopian activists who are, quote unquote, accusing Egypt for going to the Security Council. Why don't we go to the African Union? We don't go to the African Union because the African Union didn't do anything. So on and so forth. That's the first point. The second point is that right now it's a catastrophic thing for Egypt. It's suffice to bring to the attention of the audience that since 48 hours ago, when it was known to the public in Egypt that Ethiopia has notified the Egyptian Minister of Irrigation that they started the second filling, the Egyptian stock market almost collapsed. That gives you an idea about how the situation is viewed very seriously in Egypt. And if one notices also the stooges of the government who are working in information, supposedly informing people with objective facts, they are at a loss. They don't know how to handle the situation. There are a lot of signs of fissures somehow in the Egyptian regime because of the recklessness with which the Egyptian government, and in particular the Egyptian president, how did it deal with the problem since 2011 until now.
So, Edouard, we've discussed this many times before. The Nile River, it supplies water to, I think, 11 countries, as well as Ethiopia. So water is important for everyone. And as I mentioned, there are tremendous benefits economic benefits that Ethiopia is helping to gain, as well as, of course, the major benefit of being able to supply the country with electricity in a much more stable way than it's been able to. And yet, we have to acknowledge that there are concerns downstream, that there are concerns from Egypt and Sudan and others. Why is it that an agreement hasn't been able to be made about how to be confident that nobody's going to be negatively impacted?
One thing that needs to be clear is that the dam is all about sourcing energy and lighting up Ethiopia, and also allowing the Ethiopians to have a prosperous future. It's about development. This is common. I think this is well understood by Egyptian. But the problem is not that. The problem is that there is a colonial mindset in which the Egyptian government are not willing to come over. They still lack in the colonial mindset, dealing that the colonial the treaty that was signed still remains relevant, and they still believe that they are the sole or users of the water resource. So there's this political lack of will, pretty much, to accept that today is a new day. Today, Ethiopians have awakened and they wanted to use the resource. One thing that we have to underline is that just as if the Arab world was blessed by the oil, Ethiopia was blessed by this river. But for so long, Ethiopia has not been utilizing this resource for a long time. However, during the colonial time, Egypt and Sudan were able to go ahead and then make a deal for themselves disregarding Ethiopia's participation, and Ethiopians not having to voice their concern went about and then benefited from this resource. For this reason, Egypt feel like they're the sole owner of the river. That is absolutely wrong. The Egyptian government and the people need to understand that Ethiopians as well deserve to use the resources. And there's no any scientific evidence that by building this dam, by generating hydropower to light up the most disadvantaged country in Ethiopia that lacks about 65% of the population have no power. And it's all about development. It's all about survival. Ethiopians are aspiring to grow, to develop, to better themselves. In fact, Egypt should have been so supportive of such a major project. And this is not only Ethiopia's pride, but this is iconic, the biggest dam in Africa. It should be the pride of the continent. It should have been supported in such a way. However, due to the lack of will and colonial legacy and mindset, Egypt continuously appeared to not accept that this is the new dawn. This is the new beginning. They need to come to understand. And the failure for that is Egypt have a militant government that only know how to control, secure, and defend. There is no room for diplomacy. There is a root problem of diplomatic relation within the Egyptian government. They wanted to control. It is a feeling of I own it, it belongs to me. This belongers need to stop, and they need to come down, understand, accept, support the project, support the Ethiopian government go forward, and be able to come to the right term of agreement in which the upstream, downstream can all benefit. In fact, there are so many benefits from this dam that will emerge, such as providing them with a resource of power and minimizing annual flooding for Sudan or for Egypt for that matter. Therefore, I think a genuine will to sit down and talk will solve all the problem. And in addition to this, one thing I wanted to add is that Egypt has been using this as a political tool to suppress the ongoing domestic issues within Egypt itself. Therefore, by entertaining this dam issue as if they care for Egyptian population, they wanted to undermine the political tension that is unfolding in Egypt at this point.
So, Mukhtar, is this colonialism on Egypt's part? Is Egypt against Ethiopia developing? And is it only Egypt that's not entirely positive about the current developments?
Yeah, quite frankly, I like this issue of colonialism. I would like to remind our Ethiopian friend that if he's talking about the colonialist era and specifically the Convention of 1902, I would like to remind him that that convention was signed by Ethiopia, which was an independent country, was not occupied by any colonial power, while Egypt was under the British colonial power. So Egypt was the one that was occupied, while Ethiopia signed as an independent state. They should they repeat this thing a lot of times, the colonialism. What colonialism are you talking about? I mean, Egypt was the one that was under the threat of colonialism. I apologize that I have a little problem with the camera, but I hope I'm adjusting it accordingly. That's one issue. Number two, yeah, I agree with our Ethiopian friend that sometimes governments use external issues in order to just justify their internal problems. And I would like to mention that Mr. Abiy Ahmed is a great example of that. He's using the damn thing in order to try to navigate away from a lot of problems that he has. Suffice to say that a few days ago, he grudgingly, unilaterally stopped his civil war and crimes against humanity in Ethiopia. The numbers that I have read about the captured Ethiopian soldiers is staggering. I read 9,000. Whether that is true or not, obviously Mr. Abiy Ahmed is in a lot of trouble. And of course, that he is using that in order to try to reinforce some sort of national feeling and mobilize support for him inside and so on. And it's not working. Finally, I think the decisions by Mr. Abiy Ahmed and the mobilization in the Ethiopian mass media, diplomats, even the military, the Ethiopian military, are just, the statements are full of not only defiance, which is okay, but full of hatred, which is really weird. Finally, if they are talking about international law and development and stuff, why is it that they are not happy going to, because of Egypt and Sudan are going to the Security Council? They are not happy because Egypt and Sudan had gone to the American administration before. They're not happy with anything.
So, Eduardo, come back.
Yes. I wanted to note that the notion of the dam, it is predates Abiy's coming to power. When it comes to the dam, Ethiopians, either alive or dead, or to be born, are on the same page. This is the national interests. It surpasses individuals. This is the cause of millions that wanted to see development happen, that want to survive. So that needs to be understood from that kind of discourse. However, as far as what you're talking about, the international laws and whatnot, may I ask a question? Why were not Ethiopia included in the 1958 treaty that was signed only by Egypt and Sudan and not involving Ethiopia? Why? And now why is it an issue when Ethiopia choose to or decided to build this dam and become out of certain international matters that need to go to the UN Security Council? Why not the African Union? Why not there? Where is the will?
Mokhtar?
Well, quite frankly, I mean, all this stuff is nonsense. I mean, why and why and why? The Egyptian government have been trying to negotiate and knock on every available door possible, ranging from the African Union to the catastrophic 2015 treaty, triangular treaty between Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan, and so on and so forth. Quite frankly, this is a power struggle. Ethiopia is acting as an agent to other governments, hoping for rewards by causing damage to Egypt, to the Egyptian regime. The idea of the dam is geopolitical more than economic. It's the fact that the Egyptian security, water security, which is most important in the 21st century, that water security is going to be at the hands of a foreign government. And the foreign government, we know, is a very weak government. Ethiopia is a tribal country. Ethiopia has a lot of civil wars, frictions, and so on and so forth. So it can't be trustworthy to hold a grip on the Egyptian national security.
Last minute, I'm going to give to Eduardo.
One thing that I would like to note is that speaking of diplomatic way of engagement and coming to a solution, is that Ethiopia have always been willing today, then, and will be in the future. However, it is the Egypt government that continues to threaten Ethiopia's stability by creating arrest and whatnot throughout Ethiopia to stabilize the government from going forward with the project. One. Second, if there's a will from Egyptian perspective, there's always a way to sit down and negotiate and come to a solution. There is no need to go to the UN Security Council. This is an African matter that can be handled by African Union.
Unfortunately, Edouard, we have to stop there. We run out of time. Well, I think what you've both shown is that there needs to be a meeting, there needs to be an agreement. You need to sit down and talk, whether it's at the UN Security Council or not, or the African Union. It needs to be done, gentlemen. Please make sure it is. Thank you. Thank you for joining us today on The Edge. The dam is expected to reach full generating capacity in 2023, making it Africa's largest hydroelectric power plant and the world's 7th largest. The dispute now centres on how quickly Ethiopia will fill and replenish the reservoir and how much water it releases downstream in case of a multi-year drought. Cairo and Khartoum have repeatedly called for the United States, the European Union and the United Nations to join talks as mediators, while Cairo has threatened military action as a last resort. Of course, we'll keep an eye on this crisis, but for now, let's move to our next topic to speak about the Iran nuclear deal. String of attacks that Iran has faced in the recent past, the country's nuclear program has a long history. Our infographic explains. The Iranian government has accused Israel of targeting a nuclear facility near Tehran last month in a bid to derail ongoing talks over a return to its 2015 nuclear deal.
Iran has accused Israel of mounting a sabotage attack on the nuclear facility near Tehran last month. The country's state-run news agency reported, as authorities acknowledged for the first time, that the mysterious assault had caused structural damage to the site.
اولین بار هم نیست متوقف کردن تلاش‌های ایران از سوی تنها کشوری که نفت میبره که ما در حقیقت گفتگوهامون متوقف بشه داره ما پیش بینیمون هستمون این برنامه‌ها از سوی این کشور هست.
Authorities announced in late June that they had prevented saboteurs from attacking a site located in KARAJ, a city about 40 kilometers northwest of the Iranian capital. They gave no details about what the targeted building belonging to Iran's Atomic Energy Agency contained or how it was targeted. The sudden admission over last month's attack came just days after the election victory of the country's hardline judiciary chief, IBRAHIM, and followed a series of other attacks on Iran's nuclear program, including the killing of a top nuclear scientist. The allegedly foiled attack last month came amid a flurry of diplomatic activity, as diplomats in Vienna struggle to resurrect Tehran's now tattered 2015 nuclear deal with world powers, which put curbs on its enrichment activities in return for relief from US sanctions. Iranian government spokesperson Ali Rabai on Tuesday accused Israeli saboteurs of seeking to derail the nuclear negotiations in Vienna. The country has, meanwhile, struggled to stem what it describes as an Israeli-led campaign against its nuclear program.
And I'm joined live from Tehran in Iran by Dr. Mohammad Marandi, who's a Tehran University professor and political commentator. Dr. Marandi, thank you for joining us again here today on The Edge. So just last
Thank
week,
you for having me.
Just last week, we were talking about the April attack on Natanz, and now there's news of another attack at KARAJ just last month. What can you tell us about that?
Well, a small drone was used to carry out an attack. Fortunately, there was no real damage. The roof of a part of the complex was slightly damaged, and they removed that. A satellite photo was taken of that complex after the roof was removed, and they tried to exaggerate the extent of the damage through using that photo, but no real damage was caused. But in any case, this is a very dangerous escalation, and I think that without a doubt the Iranians will respond, and there will be retaliation. Iran, of course, is a huge country, and the Israeli regime uses the MEK terrorists that are based across Europe, and they have a base in Albania where most of their terrorist members are living inside a compound because they are a cult organization. They're funded by the Europeans, the Americans, Saudi Arabia, and the Israelis, and they have been cooperating in carrying out different terrorist attacks, such as the attack we saw last week. And they use U.S. embassies and installations, military bases in surrounding countries. Some believe that the Republic of Azerbaijan is being used by the Americans to help the Israelis carry out some attacks, and there's speculation that Iraqi Kurdistan is used as well as along with Afghanistan. But now that the Americans are leaving Afghanistan, it will be difficult for them to use that country as a platform for terrorist attacks.
Do you think these, what you're describing, terrorist attacks are purely for propaganda purposes, or are they actually trying to destroy infrastructure and equipment at these sites?
Ironically, this building that was attacked last week was 300 meters away from the factory that is producing the Iranian vaccine. And the people working in that factory heard the explosions. So it is not as if it's not a secret site or anything like that. It is something that's been declared, something very much out in the open. Since the attack was not successful, and since the drone was very small, one could conclude that it wasn't a serious attack and more symbolic in nature, perhaps to create greater tensions between Iran and the United States, or perhaps the United States, if it's involved, to put pressure on Iran to accept U.S. conditions for changes in the nuclear deal. In any case, this is an attack on Iranian sovereignty. It's very difficult to imagine that the Israeli regime would do anything without coordination with the United States. So one must assume, ultimately, that the United States wants to put pressure on Iran, either to accept new conditions, or maybe there are factions in the U.S. intelligence that want to wreck the deal altogether.
And let's talk about that deal. The discussions have been going on. I think 6 rounds of talks have been held so far in Vienna. What is the status of those talks, do we know? And what sort of demands are on the table for either on the Iranian side or the American side?
My understanding is that the Americans and the Europeans do not want to implement the nuclear deal as it was supposed to be implemented in 2015. And they want to impose or keep in place certain sanctions that have been imposed on Iran during the Trump years. So as we speak, the United States is continuing the same policy that it was pursuing under Trump. In other words, what Trump did was he imposed maximum pressure to make women and children suffer. The sanctions were directed at Iranian civilians to make them suffer and force the Iranian government to accept new conditions. Now it seems that Biden is doing the same thing as Trump, and the Europeans are pursuing the same policy as Biden as well. So this pressure is in order to force the Iranians to accept a new status quo. And the Iranians are saying that's just simply impossible, because the Iranians know quite well if they do accept changes to the nuclear deal, then the Americans and the Europeans can just simply impose new sanctions 6 months from now. They can say there are human rights violations. They can say Iran is supporting terrorism. They can use any excuse to impose new sanctions and then demand new concessions. And that would be appeasement if the Iranians accepted that. So the Iranians are being steadfast and saying, no, a deal is a deal. You abide by your side of the bargain. We abide by our side of the bargain. But we're not going to accept anything more than that.
Well, at the end of the day, it comes down to when an agreement is made, people should keep their promises and abide by them. And we know that hasn't always been the case against Iran. So we hope that the discussions aren't pushed off by these latest incidents and an amicable agreement can be reached, the best course for everybody. Dr. Mohammed Marandi, thank you so much for joining us today on The Edge.
Thank you so much for having me.
Iran has begun the process of producing enriched uranium, a move that could help it develop a nuclear weapon, and one that 3 European powers say threatens talks to revive the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. Iran's steps, which were disclosed by the International Atomic Energy Agency and which Tehran said aimed to develop fuel for a research reactor, also drew criticism from the United States, which called them an unfortunate step backwards. Coming weeks will show if the nuclear talks can help to solve the ongoing crisis. For now, let's move to our final topic for today to discuss the continuing gun violence in the United States. Gun violence is a huge problem in the United States. Our following infographic explains where America stands on the right to bear arms. Gun violence in the United States continues to claim lives, and a newly released report by the Gun Violence Archive shows that the 4th of July weekend saw a drastic rise in gun violence, with over 230 people killed and more than 600 injured in shootings across the US.
The latest data compiled by the Gun Violence Archive shows that at least 233 people were killed and 618 were injured by gun violence in more than 500 shootings across the United States during the 4th of July weekend. In New York, where gun violence has been rising to levels not seen in years, there were 35 victims, 2 fatal, from 29 shootings that occurred Friday to Monday. So far this year, gun violence incidents in New York have spiked almost 32% over the same period in 2020, with 773 shootings and 895 victims. The US has been hit by a surge in shootings since the start of the coronavirus pandemic. President Joe Biden unveiled a strategy to combat gun violence on June the 24th that urged a united effort to reduce gun violence.
And I'm joined live from Balıkesir in Turkey by Bülent Yavuz, who's a political analyst. Bülent, Thank you for joining us. Can you hear me?
Well, thank you for having me in.
Thank you, Bert. Now, you're normally, I should up your credentials by saying you're normally resident in Florida. So what can you tell us about how this surge of killings over the July 4th weekend, what is this in terms of the bigger picture of gun violence in the US?
Well, and the overall year 2021 is a record year when it comes to gun violence. That's something that we see throughout the year so far, and the numbers that I have in front of me, it just tells us that about more than 22,000 gun violence deaths happened so far during the year. And as you said, just in the July 4th weekend, the numbers that were killed are in excess of 200s, and it's rising. These figures are well above the averages that we've seen in 2019 or in 2020. Part of it is alluded to the COVID pandemic, for somehow the feeling of violence, and the research showed that has been up throughout the communities in the United States as a result, as a consequence of the COVID pandemic. That's an interesting finding that many respectable institutions discovered. And that was not actually expected. Many other things were anticipated as a result of COVID, which didn't happen. But none of these things, including the rise in violence. But it's a factual thing. But with COVID or not, we see the violence going up every year. And the numbers are staggering, and it's very quite disturbing.
Although it's early days to analyse the data for this year, does this appear to be politically or economically related, or is it just that there are just too many guns in the United States?
Well, first of all, there are too many guns in the United States. There is not very much link to the political differences between within the communities that alludes to the violence. Now, there's no clear-cut evidence on that. However, the community-wide violences are up, especially like these parties, the block parties, and the 4th of July weekend. There's so many of them. Now, what was the reason for that? Was that a difference in political opinions or some grudges between neighbors, etc.? That is not really clear. But what is clear that it hurts predominantly Black and brown communities more so. But also all communities of all colors have been affected, impacted. Poor neighbors more so, urban settings more so. There are some trends that we see, but the numbers are unacceptable to any civilized society. Mm-hmm. And the sad part of it is that there is no unified standing within the country against this gun violence. I mean, everybody hates it. Everybody is against it. Don't take it wrong. But people differ when it comes to how to handle it or the reasons behind it. There are dramatic differences within people in the United States.
And of course, the supporters of the Second Amendment would point to other data that there was a report I saw recently showed in one state where open carry had been allowed, where people are allowed to actually have their weapons visible that the rate of crime in those states had gone down 90%, was one figure I saw. So is there a correlation perhaps between the regulation of guns and the checks that are done for guns and these shootings?
Well, it's not really clear cut, and there is a lot of political clout on this argument. Politicians in both part of the aisle make arguments pro and con for gun control. The data overall, I mean, respectable data overall, state that there is no a very clear-cut evidence on a severe restriction or just a free use of the guns. Unfortunately, the data is not very decisive. So that makes things even more complicated. Then it becomes the issue around the Second Amendment, how to interpret that. There is a political divide on that one. The pro-gun control folks state that the gun control initiatives actually do not diminish the Second Amendment, and actually prevents selling to the wrong folks, and also
this of course is this, of course, is a huge debate that is going to go on and on. Bülent, thank you for joining us today here on The Edge. Pleasure to speak with you. And I'm now joined live from New York by Oscar Odum, who's a former NYPD detective and criminal justice professor. Dr. Odum, thank you for joining us today on The Edge. As you just heard, we were just discussing how the regulation of guns may or may not have affected the shootings. But from the perspective of law enforcement, I know that the police were working incredibly hard over the July 4th weekend to take guns out of the hands of people that shouldn't be having them. What do you see as the biggest cause of these shootings?
Well, first part of it is, of course, legislation, how they legislate who can have guns. Like in New York City, it's very tough to get weapons. And I can imagine what it would be like if we did not have the type of legislation that we have as far as restricting who can and cannot have weapons. The other part is, once people are locked up or arrested for having firearms, there should be some sort of system put in place with, besides taking the firearms, that the people are actually locked up, and if they're going to let them out, they're monitored or put on some program or something like that, as opposed to letting them come in with the weapon, get arrested, and then just come right back out, and they actually beat the officers out of the processing. So they must do something with the legislation, and when people are arrested, they must be detained before they are let out again.
Now, the big soundbite from New York in the last few days has been from Governor Andrew Cuomo, who's described this as an epidemic, an epidemic, and declared a state of emergency against guns. Is that correct? And is his ambition to take things in the right direction from your perspective?
Well, it's in the right direction, but I think a lot of this could have been curtailed with all this defund the police movement and cutting police officers and cutting the budget and stopping the anti-crime unit. See, one of the things they fail to understand is this: is that if you don't have a plainclothes police officer around, a criminal will look around. If they don't see a uniform, they know that it's a green light to commit a crime because of the fact that there are no plainclothes officers. So by removing those plainclothes officers, they threw the baby out with the bathtub on their defunding and anti-police movement, and the criminals just went wild. Because if they would have had plainclothes police officers, a lot of these crimes would have been taken care of. If they would have had all this defund the police movement and have all these early retirements, you wouldn't have lost all these seasoned officers. And when they did that, they are now paying the price. And now that's why they want a refund. That's why they want to have overtime. That's why they have this epidemic out on the war against guns now and get people back out there.
So in fact, it's very much a systemic problem that is about funding the police properly, having enough police officers on the ground, and also dealing with people who are in the judicial system to make sure that that they don't go out onto the streets and cause more trouble.
Absolutely. And the thing is, like I said, things must be evidence-based and data-driven. The data has shown over this weekend within large cities in New York City, there were over 400 shootings and over 150 homicides. So dead bodies don't lie, no matter what they say. I said, when you go to the hospital and people have bullet wounds on it, so there's no lie, there's no playing around, there's no miscalculations on the data, and you can stack the bodies up as high as I don't know how far, but those dead bodies do not lie. So that's the data that is an actual fact. Victims that are in the hospitals with bullet wounds and the dead bodies that are in the morgue. So they realize that the alarm is off, and you have to let the police officers be proactive as opposed to being reactive for fear of repercussion and all this legislation that is taking place.
Well, I know that sadly behind all of this there are huge political arguments. Let's hope that the human argument that life should be preserved is the one which wins the day. Dr. Oscar, thank you so much for joining us today here on The Edge.
Thanks for having me. Have a great day.
Thank you. Now, thousands of people are killed by guns in the United States every year. US President Joe Biden announced new actions to tackle gun violence, while some states have taken steps to ban or strictly regulate ownership of assault weapons. We hope that all these measures will bring an end to the continuing gun violence in the United States. Now, our analysts have provided their insights on today's top stories. Let's have a roundup of what they had to say. Now, before closing our programme, let's take a look at social media to hear your voices and reactions on today's top story, shared with the hashtag #GunViolence. And here's what you've been saying about gun violence on Twitter. Joyce Ann says, the right wants you to believe Democrats want to defund the police, and that's why crime increased. Because this country has more guns than people. Nuri Baal says, in the USA, 400 shootings and 150 killed over the US Independence Day weekend. Had this been in India or anywhere else, the USA would have poked its nose, citing democracy in danger. And Sinead O'Brien says New York is under a statewide disaster emergency concerning gun violence. Dedicated money to address it, not just token words. Now take a look at our video of the day, which tells the story of Yushra Mardini, who's a refugee Olympic athlete.
We don't share a nation or a language. Each of us has a different story, but there is something we all have in common. We chose to keep our dreams alive. We carried them with us, across oceans and deserts and cities. We brought them together to form a team greater than ourselves. One that defies borders and limits. A team that belongs to everyone. Because the starting line doesn't care who we are, only that we face it together.
And that's all for this episode of The Edge with me, Andy Boynes. Stay tuned as we'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth analysis on the top stories and a look beyond the edge.